Welcome to the Scale Molder Geek, and for my very first diorama for 2023, I'm going to build something that I've been wanting to do for about 30 years now, and it's War of the Worlds. Now, as much as I love the 1953 and the 2005 versions, I've always wanted to see the original story that was set in the 1890s. And Jeff Wayne did that with his musical, and then luckily we got the 2019 series, which was a British series, and that was set in the correct time period. Now, I found this awesome 3D file on Thingiverse, and I'll leave the link in the description. The only thing I didn't like was the actual legs. They looked a bit scrawny and didn't look like they were going to work properly. So I did do some modifications to the file, so it will suit my purposes. And you can see I also did some changes to the basket catcher there. Now, I started off with the base, and as I said, I chopped off the legs and I replaced them with ball joints. This was a very simple process to do. And then I went into a piece of software called Blender and created these leg joints from scratch, and I'm just using some simple basic shapes there, circles, cylinders and that type of thing, and then threw them into Chitterbox to actually print out. Now, I printed these originally in clear simply because I was thinking of putting some LED lights into the actual body, because I wanted that big eye thing glowing. And that's what they look like all printed up. Now, I'm using brass rod for the actual legs, mainly for a bit of sturdiness, to give them a bit of strength. And those joints, the leg joints that I created, have got a hole straight down the middle, so those brass rods just go straight through it. Well, they're actually tubing, they're hollow. In the original H.G. Wells novel, the most powerful weapon they had against the Martian War Machines was a ship called the Thunderchild. So I needed to find an actual ship that was from that era, and I came across this ship, and it's a French ship called the Bouvet. It's from the right time period. And a bit of a hunt, I finally found it on Thingiverse as well. Now, I originally thought I'd print the hull in two pieces, simply so I can fit as much as I could onto the printing plate. Turned out to be a bit of a mistake because I ended up with these huge joints. I really didn't want to spend all my time actually filling then sanding those joints. Now, the conning towers were actually separately printed as well, and they kind of didn't fit as well as I hoped they would. So I kind of thought, okay, what I might do is jump into Blender and do some modifications to original 3D file. And also give it a slightly different silhouette, so it doesn't look like the Bouvet, because it has to look like the British ship, the Thunderchild. So I started off with just adding some supports there, because that running deck, or whatever that thing is, was a bit thin, so I fixed that up and actually modified that running deck as well. And because this is a waterline 3D file, I need to do a bottom half to it as well. And also I created some lifeboats. Now, I found these lifeboats on Thingiverse again and just added it to the ship. Now, those lifeboats aren't perfectly to scale, but close enough. And also a third smokestack and some conning towers to the actual ship. And then threw it into Chitterbox to print, and this was a huge print in the fact that it took about 22 hours to actually print. But it was definitely well worth the printing time, because it came out wonderfully perfect, and I had the whole ship in one go. So you can see all the little extra details I added to it. And I also wanted some new gun turrets. Didn't want to keep the original ones that came with the 3D print because they looked a bit weird. So I created these brand new ones in Blender, and again, look at that, they're very simple to create because I'm just using basic shapes, cylinders and squares or cubes. And there's my turret, simple as that. And what I do, I print in multiples, simply because if something goes wrong, something breaks or I lose something, I've got plenty. And I can always use them as greeblies in other projects. And that's comparing the two. The original turret actually had a single barrel, and mine doubles. Now, onto the rigging. I'm just drilling a small hole into the, it's a mast, I guess, I don't know what you call them, and just putting some thread through it, some cotton thread, and at each end I'm just using a bit of super glue to hold it down. And once that's dry, I then stretch it fairly taut and drop a super glue at the other end as well. I'm just making up as I go along. It is a fictional ship, so who knows what it's supposed to look like. This is the second ship I've ever built in my life. The first one I built probably about 25 years ago, and that was a US frigate. This is the first time I ever actually printed a ship, and so far so good. The more I use Blender, the more it gives me the opportunity to actually grab hold of 3D files and actually modify them to suit my needs. So I'm ending up with this really unique ship. It's a one of a kind, and hopefully people aren't going to recognize it as the Beauvais. Now for the actual rigging, I'm using some of this primer, and this will hopefully stop some of the hairy bits on the actual thread. Now off camera I designed these guns and some more detail to add to the ship. Now those are the custom turrets I designed. And I've got to admit, it's looking pretty fierce. Now on the other side, this side, I've actually left out some of the weaponry there, because right in the middle there, I'm actually going to add an explosion with some LED lights and some cotton buds. So I need to drill a hole in there. My Dremel tool comes in very handy in this little instance. And because it's a hollow ship, it's so easy to actually get the wiring through it. And with the first undercoat all done, it's time to actually put on the base colour, which is this dark sea grey from Vallejo. And it's looking good. Maybe a little bit dark, but I like it. And for the poop decks, or the running decks, or the deckways, I have no idea what you call it, that beige colour from Vallejo. And I'm using this off-white for the lifeboats and also for the smokestacks or ship funnels, either or either. And just like everything else on this build, I'm just making it up as I go along. Now for the very top of those smokestacks, I'm just going to paint them red. Only because I think it looks pretty cool. No other reason. This is probably the most inaccurate British ship in the history of mankind. But it looks cool. With all the base colours blocked in, it's time to add the weathering. Now I'm starting off with this Vallejo wash, and it's a black. Now quick spritz of water, and all this does is make the wash actually flow a lot easier across the body. By the way, if you haven't already, smash that like button and subscribe to the channel. Your support will be greatly appreciated. And with the wash all done and dried, it was time to actually add a bit of dry brushing, just to pop out some of those highlights. I'm using a combination of this Panzer Grey and the light sand, and hitting the high areas of that ship. And for the gun turrets, I'm just hitting it with that gunmetal from Ammo. And also some of this light metal for the detail on the actual deck. Off camera, I jumped into Photoshop and created these decals, and then using my laser printer, I printed it onto white decal paper and cut them out, stuck them on. Now that decal actually says HMS Thunderchild, and being the 1890s, the person reigning would have been Queen Victoria, so it would have been Her Majesty's ship. And if I'm wrong, please let me know in the comments, because I know nothing about British ships. Zero. But they look good. Well, this one looks good. Now it needs one more thing, and that's some rust on the hull. Now I'm using these weathering pencils from AK, which I've never ever used before. So this will be a learning process for me. And my first mistake was I tried to put the pencil through a sharpener to get a finer point to it. And because the actual innards of it, is it a grease pencil or something like that, was so soft it just kept on snapping. So I had to resort to a hobby knife to sharpen it. Or get a new sharpener with a really sharp blade. And once I got the really fine point to it, the way to use it after a bit of research, because like I said I'd never ever used these before, was to actually dip it in a bit of water and just draw a bit of rust on where you need it. And what I also did was then I grabbed the brush and dipped it in the water and kind of just blended. And I was really happy the way it actually turned out, considering it was my very first time. This stuff is actually really good, so I'm planning to use it a bit more often, and hopefully with a bit more practice I'll kind of get the hang of it. Have a look at that, it's not too shabby if I do say so myself. Nice finish to it, though the deck could have been a bit more even. Now onto the Martian War Machine. Now like I said originally, I was going to put an LED light into the middle of it, but after a bit of testing I found there was something inside the print that was stopping it from shining through very brightly. A support or something like that, I don't know, but ended up having to dump that idea. And these are the 3D printed joints, the leg joints, and they have a hole straight down the center of it, so I can run those brass tubes through them. And that's the basket to go on the back. The people catcher. Now I made the hole to fit exactly the size of that brass rod, or rather tube. And then it was just a matter of measuring it up to make sure they're all nice and even and evenly spaced. And to actually cut this tube, I've got this brass tube cutter, and it's just a matter of adjusting a little wheel that's inside the middle of it and making it a bit tighter, twirling it, and it gives a really nice clean cut to it. And as you can see, it slides straight in. And there's my 3 legs. Once again, making sure they're all measured evenly. And the leg joints were just actually super glued into place. What I'm doing here is drilling some holes for those tentacle things. Yeah, the ones that pick up the people, stick them into the people basket, and also one that actually holds the laser as well. It'll look like something else. And into the Greeblies box of mine, and I'm using these little bits and pieces to put together a laser. I'm trying to find kind of a retro feel to the actual laser, and tentacle just wraps around there. And for the top of the actual legs, I'm just using some of these nuts and bolts that I actually printed up ages ago, and a bit of super glue to lock them into place. Now the fine wire for the actual tentacles, and to dress up the ends of the bare wire, I dipped it into some resin, created a teardrop at the end, and then solidified it with some UV light. And to hold everything into place, some super glue, because it's super. As you can see, I twisted the wire around the laser, and for the second tentacle I kind of twisted it to make it look like it was alive and had some movement into it. And there it is, completely assembled and ready for some paint very shortly. It's a shame I couldn't get the light going in it, but kind of still happy with the final finish of it. Now for the base colour, I'm just using some black. Now I'm also going to use some of this green stuff colour shift metal, which is a chameleon paint, because it changes colour as you look at it from different angles. I'm trying to just get that really alien worldly, or rather off-worldly look to it. Now I've used this stuff a number of times and I really love the look at it. I tend to use it on anything that looks a bit, alienish. If you haven't smashed that like button or subscribed to the channel, here's a friendly reminder. And the final part to be glued onto the Martian War Machine is the people basket in the back. And now finally with this light metal to give it a bit of a dry brush, and I'm just going to hit some of the highlights there. And to add a bit of visual interest, some of this gold leaf from Tamiya for the actual laser. Now I'm using some of this green stuff world chrome metal for the base of the actual eye. And once this chrome is actually dry, I'm then going to give it a couple coats of actually some clear red from Tamiya. Once I've done the edges with a fine brush, I then go in with a flat brush and give it a nice even coat. Now that I have the two vehicles all completed, it's time to move on to the diorama base. First thing I need to do is give it a quick layout just so I know where everything goes. And then once I'm happy with its placement, I then plot out where I need to actually cut out a hole for the ship to be recessed into. To cut out the recessed area, I'm using one of these hot knives. But as you can see, it creates a lot of fumes, so make sure you're wearing a mask for this. And if possible, an open window as well. Now at the bottom of the actual diorama base, I also need to cut out an area for the battery compartment. Problem is, I got a bit ahead of myself and I actually cut it out in the wrong place. Now that little slot is actually directly underneath the ship, so I couldn't get enough depth out of it, so I had to move it over slightly. Like that. Not to worry, it won't be seen. Now to create the waves, I used some crumpled aluminium foil with a bit of PVA glue to stick it to the base, and some wire pins to hold it in place while it dries. And once that whole base is actually covered with the aluminium foil, I then give it a coat of PVA glue. Now the reason I do that is simply because I want to put another sheet of aluminium foil over the top. Now the reason I'm doing this is actually to unify all the separate pieces together and also soften up some of those, wavy things. And this actually gives me a much more realistic waveform. And you can see it's actually starting to look really, really good. A bit shiny, but it is looking good. Once that is completed, we need to give the whole base another coat of PVA glue. And the reason we're doing it this time around is so the paint can actually stick to the tin foil. And you can see with the glue all dry, it's left this satin finish to it. And this will make a great base for the next step. Let's stick the ship into place with some hot stick glue. And then some more PVA glue and some more tin foil as well to fill up the gap between the ship and the waves. Now onto the painting of the ocean. I'm using a combination of that black and the green, and I need a really dark green for the base colour. And I've just added some white to the combination that I created and just hitting the top ends of those waves. Once that is done, we add some more white to it and hitting the very peak of those waves. And that's what it looks like when the base colours are all dry. So to add a bit more realism to it, we actually need to hit the top of that with some impasto gel. Now this is a really thick clear medium, And once it dries, it actually adds slightly more texture to it, and it adds that gloss that we need for the ocean. Good news, it actually doesn't remain like this, it goes clear. And it will look a lot more realistic. Now, to add some of the foaminess to the waves that are hitting the ship, I'm just using some cotton wool here. And some white glue to hold it into place. And once the hull of the ship is all done, I'll add some impasto gel onto the top of that. Now for a bit of fun, let's create the explosion. Bit of acrylic tube there, and I'm just using some of those LED filaments. You can get those off AliExpress, very cheap. Once I prepare the wiring, I then solder them to the filament. Now on the filament, the end that has a small hole in it is actually the positive side. And a couple of AA batteries, because these are only 3 volt. So not dangerous power at all. For the actual explosion, I'm using some of this cotton ball that I've unwrapped, and I'm just going to glue it to the acrylic tube. I can then do a bit of puffing, a bit of shaping of it, and we can get the right shape that we need. Once I've got it roughly to where I need it, the first coat I use is some of this orange fire from Vallejo. Then hitting it with some red. Then for some of the highlights, I'm just going to hit it with some yellow. Or sun yellow. Once that's done, it's just a matter of sliding onto the filament. And that's our explosion. Now to hold it into place, I did use some PVA glue, and I stuck it to the hull as well as the ocean. And there it is. I think it's actually come up pretty well for my first ever explosion. Now of course, because the ship's been blown up, it needs some debris coming out of the blast. So I'm just gluing some of the small turrets to it, and some pieces of plastic painted the same colour as the ship. To glue down the Martian War Machine, I just ended up using some of that impasto gel. And that was about all I needed to do. Other than the fact I actually ended up going in off camera and adding some more black to the explosion. And with that all completed, I think it's time to show off with the final hero images. Or this time, it's footage.